Hi, everybody, and welcome back to EBNet Stream. Overnight, the FSCA published their survey on the two-pot fees that administrators have been charging since the 1st of September last year. I thought I'd catch up with Michelle Acton, who is the Chief Customer Officer from Old Mutual, and understand from her perspective her views and opinions on this report. Welcome to EBNet Stream, Michelle.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with the high level. Thoughts on the report in general?
So I think we've got to take it for what it is. Essentially, the FSCA sent out a request with Excel spreadsheets to ask people for what their costs are. And really, they've put forward a summary of the information they've received. So it's really just focused on costs, on the different aspects. And I think we've got to take it for what it is. I worry about reading too deeply into it because I think there's a lot of information that's not there. But overall, I think it's a really, really good start with just helping people understand, first of all, how much was actually invested in the changes that were put in place.
Talking about how much, I saw in the appendix to the report that Old Mutual charged a transaction fee of, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 200 or 250 Rand to process each savings pot withdrawal. Can you talk me and retirement fund members through why this fee needs to be charged?
So I think what's important is the fact that there's actually, I would say, 3 levels of costs that that everybody went under or incurred last year, or still incurring actually. So the first one is around the actual infrastructure changes, right? And that is updating to enable the pots. What people forget is we actually needed to update the exit process and the claims processing around that, tax directives, integration. The other is then enabling the savings pot withdrawal, which was a brand new capability. And the last aspect is actually the ongoing costs. So it's one thing to have the enablement, it's the other, the cost to process when you come through. So if you include all of those costs, we looked at what was the best with everything that we've invested in terms of that to find a reasonable fee that will cover those costs sustainably. So I think none of us are expecting costs to be covered in first month of go live. To ensuring that they've been covered sustainably at a price that is reasonable to members. So we did go out with a flat fee of 250 Rand. And essentially, we felt that would be sufficient to, over the next couple of years, actually cover what was invested in the two-pot system. Yeah.
So I'm glad you kind of set out the different, let's call them buckets instead of pots of fees. The survey findings show that 42% of administrators charged either a savings pot withdrawal fee or increased their base admin fees, or did both, right? So you very nicely set out that you had these or have these additional costs for doing savings pot withdrawals. And then some administrators looked to increase their base admin fees. Did Old Mutual increase their ongoing or base administration fees?
Marginally, but very marginally. I think it was a small proportion in terms of the overall cost from that perspective.
Retirement fund members and trustees, why that would be necessary?
So I think there's 2 elements to it. The one is if we in the world we are in terms of retirement fund administration, the whole two-pot system was a whole transformational change, right? It wasn't like a quick tweak here. It was a massive change. So the balancing act around how the fees are going to be charged is very dependent on a business model. So I think every administrator, and we've seen that from this report, right? We've seen from this report that every administrator or retirement fund might have a different way of charging fees, recouping fees, because they've got different models of receiving income in the first place. So I think that's important to take into account, that there's no straight line. There is no industry norm of this is how you should do things. So it's very difficult for each administrator. And I think that's one of the challenges with this report, is if you read it at face value, you might go, oh, that fund is 0 and that fund. But I think there's a lot of other factors and characteristics that need to take into account. around what needs to happen. And a fund, for example, like Old Mutual, as an administrator and one of the largest administrators in the country, you've got to enable capability across all different platforms, across different income levels, the communication. There's a lot of elements around that you've got to be ready for. So I think if you look at that around how do we, with all the changes that are coming through or have come through and still coming through, as well as what it looks like into the future, I think we're comfortable that what we've done is a sustainable introduction of changes, but it's not unaffordable or what's the right word? Yeah, I think you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. So it's such an interesting thing because yes, there's been a lot of infrastructure, let's call it infrastructure or system development, and these marginal administration fees that Old Mutual has levied on their base fees. Other administrators are doing different things or have done different things exactly as per the reasons that you've laid out for us. But one of the interesting findings in the FSCA's report is that they reckon these infrastructure or investments or system investment costs will be recouped by year 3. I mean, could we anticipate, or should trustees anticipate administrators then reviewing their fees once these costs have been recouped?
So I think, I mean, if you look at the request for running costs of fees, I think it only asked up to year 3. So I think it varies in terms of depending on how much was invested, what the requirements were. I do think that there will be, whether it's year 2 for, into the future, absolutely a need to relook once we've got that base foundation and we've got a better idea of volumes and costs and all of that sort of thing coming into play. But I think it's very difficult to assess, like at this point in time, to say this is what's happening, because I mean we're not even a year in. So it's still very, very early days. And I think that's also one of the challenges with this report is the fact that it's looking at what we know now. I mean, this was done, the information was requested in September, I think it was last year. And a lot's happened since September. And when this was done, there was also a lack of, there wasn't a proper understanding of what are the volumes going to look like. It was based on estimated costs. It was based on what, there's things we've incurred, but we don't know what's going to be incurred into the future. And we haven't factored in the fact that actually going forward, we're going into a world of compulsory preservation. There's going to be a lot more fund values, smaller amounts. The dynamic of the funds are going to change somewhat. The servicing need for paid up members and active members are going to change a lot. So this is a transformation that we are literally less than a year into. So I think it's very, very difficult at this point to say, yes, by this date we should see, because I think we're going to see a lot of other adjustments which aren't really mentioned here. I mean, what it will be, I mean, they talk about the concept of cost subsidization, but that's in innate nature of retirement funds, right? So if you think about it, retirement funds in their pure nature have an element of cost subsidization. I mean, for example, you could have a situation where everyone pays the same fee, admin fee, but yet you've got someone who does regular switching and someone who doesn't. You've got a situation where everybody might pay the same fee and some people resign and some people don't. You've got this. So I think as it stands at the moment, we've got a range of different fee structures and business models that administrators take on in order to cover income minus expenses. And it might also be through a balance of things. I do think going forward, we are going to see things shift as the nature of retirement funds change. So everybody's had to incur this big cost. And we're all not denying there's quite a lot of money that was spent on it. There's different decisions that have been made with what information we had at the time around, do you just charge a savings pot fee? Do you increase your base fee? Do you do a combination? I think all administrators did it with what they know. But I do believe there's, as you go into the future and we learn more and we better figure out and we see savings pot values, not say like retirement values are increasing, which is what we expect to see, which should innately bring you in economies of scale. More people will continue using the savings pot. It'll get easier to service. So there's going to be a lot of things that are are going to change into the future. So I think it's very difficult to say, right, by this date, we're going to see a change. I think we're going to see this industry evolve. So it'll be very different, I think, for various administrators.
You've actually sparked another question in my mind, and that is around the potential or the possibility of um, costs and fee scales or fee mechanisms changing completely. I mean, I'm thinking off the top of my head, imagine a fee per service kind of arrangement, because I will admit openly, I'm quite a grumpy individual because I don't plan on making a savings pot withdrawal, and I'm cross-subsidizing, which is the word that you and the report uses. I'm cross-subsidizing those who are. So could we see a complete overhaul of how fees are charged?
Yeah, I mean, I can't, in terms of predicting the future, I think that's always possible. Our industry is evolving. I mean, if we look at where we're going into the future with the world of, talking about moving into worlds of consolidation and moving into, if we look at mandatory coverage as that comes into the future, etc., I think this industry is going to change a lot. And as I said, we're only just less than a year into into two parts. We haven't even begun to get a feel of what does the world look like when you've got preservation sitting and you might have money in 5 different funds, or do you consolidate, and how does that look? Because remember, our world's changing for the better. So I mean, I think absolutely in a world where where worlds are getting agile, we're going more digital. There's greater demand on services. Members are getting more involved in their funds, which is exactly what we want. I don't see that there wouldn't. But yeah, our industry's never been known historically for change very quickly. I mean, that's been the wonder of two-part, right? I mean, we're an industry that hasn't changed in 23 years or 20 to 30 years. Our change muscle's quite weak, but yet we've managed to implement a program as this large as an industry, and even the report refers to it being exceptionally successfully. So yeah, I think looking into the future, I would love to see a lot more innovation in our industry. So it's around the space to be able to innovate and come up with a sort of what can be implemented. And I think that's the other thing I just want to touch on. The one thing that we also haven't been taken into account in this report, it doesn't really reflect on the size of the funds. What is their makeup? What is their, employer type? Because if you're just an employer fund, your requirements might be very, very different and who's picking up costs, right? Because this talks to administrators, but what about funds? What about other costs? So I think there's a whole lot of elements that need to be looked at or sort of taken in perspective when you're reading this. But I think when it comes to some of the big changes as well is some administration systems only have the capability of deducting fees with 2 mechanisms, as an example, from assets or from fund values, or it only has the mechanism so a lot of these things I think often only implement based on what the systems can do currently versus what it could do into the future, for example. So I think that's also interesting. You sort of look, I mean, I saw there was also a note around some people have decided, some administrators took the money from the savings pot and others took it from the fund value, and I suppose there's a lot of debate of what's right and what's wrong, but as I started off with, there's no industry norm on this yet. So I think it'll be interesting to 10 years from now look back at what's changed as we've gone along the process, but it's also the balance of let's let everything settle now, right? Because we've had a lot now. It's a great balancing act, right?
Well, everything except cybersecurity, which will be settled in the next 5 or so days.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with this
Hopefully.
sort of industry, right? You sit there and you want to try and talk about innovation and how, but part of the challenge is there's a lot of onus on compliance and getting things ready as well. So it really is, and cost, right? So how do we ensure that we're optimally giving members the best cost that they can get to maximize outcomes? So it's yeah, and then the other question with the other element, which is not really mentioned here, is the behavioral side, right? So, because some funds might have taken the decision to say, I'm going to charge the fee on the savings pot versus the admin fee because I want to deter withdrawals.
Sure.
So there's a lot of dynamics that I think are not quite covered when you look at face value. So I'll be interested if I mean, I always look at this and I think phase two would be great around FSCA interviewing funds and getting a real feel of what their experience was now that we're a bit further along. But I mean, they have mentioned they're going to have more conversations with various players. So I think this is a story that's evolving.
Absolutely right. And as Michelle rightly says, the FSCA has indicated that they will be, I can't remember the exact words, but they will be engaging with the outlying stakeholders, whatever that means. Um, but kind of back to the contents of the report and to wrap up our conversation. I kind of get a sense from you this concept of proportionality, in as much as we've applied it to cybersecurity, et cetera, as we've been, that's been the hot conversation over the last few weeks and months. It seems to apply broader than that. If you're looking at funds, bigger funds have more compliance requirements, bigger systems, bigger number of members, bigger assets, et cetera. Smaller funds have littler ones. So are we kind of getting into a world now where the size of your fund matters, in as much as compliance issues are concerned or fees might be concerned?
I think it does. This industry, especially as we see, we've had such an increase in governance and compliance and regulatory requirements. I think it is going to be harder and harder for smaller funds to maintain and keep up. It's a lot. Where if you've got like your large administration or your large umbrella funds, this is their core business, right? This is what they do. Where sometimes for your smaller funds, it's not necessarily the case. So I think it is getting more and more onerous. And I mean, interestingly, I was reading a report in from the Australian market, and the Australian market is absolutely seeing a huge amount of consolidation in their space. It's not regulated consolidation, but it's natural consolidation that's happening because of the fact that the smaller guys around admin efficiencies, around the ability to innovate better if you're larger, around the fact that actually just trying to keep up with the governance requirements become harder. So I think it is naturally, no matter which country you're in, a situation that as you move on and as we get into a world that has a lot more focus on governance and a number of other, not just governance, right? It's a lot to be able to manage these funds and keep up with these elements that are coming through. So I do think that we should. I mean, we have seen a huge amount of consolidation, right?
Yeah.
And if we look at our industry 20 years ago, 25 years ago to where it is now, it's completely different from a landscape of where the retirement funds are. But I do think this does put a lot of pressure on the smaller administrators around just trying to keep up.
Mm. One last question to wrap up, and it's just a catch-all. Having read the report, I appreciate it's brand new. We're still going to have a lot of unpacking over the coming weeks. Anything that you'd like to raise that was brought out in the report? I know there were some kind of ancillary comments made that had nothing to do with fees. Any of those that you think trustees should be aware of?
No, no. I mean, I read through it, and I think what's important is you've got, as I mentioned at the beginning, you've got to take it from what it is, which is a report analyzing fees and costs that have been incurred at a point in time for what people knew in September. And a lot of it was based on preparation because we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know how big the volumes were going to be. The second is, of course, every fund has handled it in a different way, based on what they knew then. I was speaking earlier to someone saying we forget how much legislation uncertainty we had and how
True.
much pressure there was and so everybody was doing what they could at that particular time, knowing what they had without a best practice. I think what is interesting is the results have come out to demonstrate that overall people have invested, and we've seen the results of it, good money into an infrastructure required for a whole new system and a whole new and I think that it is great to see that. I think what's going to be interesting is as this plays out, how how things start to evolve as we start seeing fees coming through in 4, 5, or 6 years from now. The administrators that, for example, didn't charge fees, what does it look like in a couple of years from now, as we're going forward? So yeah, I think it's great that this has happened, and it's great. The transparency is also really good. I think it's great to see reports like this coming out, to help just the industry get a feel of actually what is happening out there.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for taking the time to chat to EVNet today. One last question. The nails are interesting. Are those Comrade logos on your nails?
They are. Yes, I've got my nails decorated for that 90K run next weekend. So excuse the yellow, but it's my trend every year.
Well, good luck for your run next weekend, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us this afternoon.
Perfect. Thank you. Cheers.